to amazing. I love all these people in here. I'll pass it over to my lovely co-organizer, Temi, to get us rolling today. Thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. And thank you all for joining us on our first session, calling educational psychologists into critical and multicultural research methods. My name is Temi Tokbe Adelye. I go by Temi, or Dr. T, as my students call me, and I specialize in student motivation. I'm currently a clinical assistant professor, and I'm also an assistant director of the Blue Sky Teaching and Learning Lab in the Honors College at Purdue University. Allison, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Zengalowski. I am currently a postdoc at the University of California, Davis. And I'm so excited that all of you are joining us here today. This was born out of Temi and I, a chance interaction at last year's AERA. So we're excited to have a community joining us in some of the ideas we discussed there.
Yeah, so as Allison was sharing, we came from the Motivation SIG business meeting last year, and we happened to sit on the same couch at the mixer, and we were both just like, I really wish we had opportunities to learn more about critical and multicultural methods. And so we decided to submit to AERA, like that was a definite. But then we started joking, like, what if we could host a whole workshop series where we could learn about these things and have some experts in the different fields join us? And so we pitched it to Corey and Jess, and they took it to the leadership, and not surprisingly, I guess. But the Motivation SIG was on top of it, and they were even suggesting that we should partner with some different organizations. So thanks to APA's Division 15 on Race and Diversity Committee, because now we get to have these joint sessions where I think it's really important that we look across different organizations for expertise. So yeah, we are excited to jump into today's session on researching paradigms. Before we do that, though, we just wanted to give you an overview of what we'll be getting into. So we're going to start off by learning about paradigms, and then we'll hear from our panelists about how they use paradigms in their critical and multicultural work. After that, we'll go into some breakout rooms and discuss how paradigms exist or don't in our fields. And then we'll engage our panelists in a Q&A session and close up with what's next from this workshop series. So I'll leave this up for a few moments, but don't worry, we'll also drop the link to this folder in the chat. What we decided is that we want to make sure you have a constant ability to engage with our materials that we bring up. And so this is a QR code and a link. If you go to bit.ly/motsig crit folder, that will open up the Google Drive folder that we're going to be using for the entire series. And so that's where, as I'm sure today, a lot of useful resources will be shared. We'll be dropping links to those in the different files there. So for today, there's a Google document that we'll be using for the breakout rooms and throughout the session, as well as a Jamboard that you can access once we share some ability to do that. So let's jump in. What is a paradigm? A paradigm is a very complex thing that informs how we engage in research. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to read through this lengthy but really helpful description, and then I'll unpack a few of those bolded items so we can jump into thinking about what paradigms are. And so as you finish up reading, feel free to drop in the chat if you had any thoughts about what a paradigm was, if this is new for you, if this is something you work with every day. But we wanted to share this definition because one, it was, I won't say fully exhaustive. We can't ever fully define a thing, but it gets at a lot of the key elements of the reasonings why we were thinking that this would be a useful session. And so the very first thing it says is that it's a conceptual lens, meaning that it's what you use to look at and shape and inform your research. And so I bolded a few other things in this quote from the Kavunja and Kuyani piece from 2017. And so the second bolded item says that it's used to determine methods that will be used and how the data will be analyzed. And this says it in a very definitive way, as in this is what we always intentionally do. But I wanted to also point out that sometimes if we are not thinking about paradigms and the conceptual lens we're using, it still will influence how we select and analyze our data. And then the paradigm, as I was suggesting, also defines a researcher's philosophical orientation and has significant implications for every decision made in the research process. And so they list out that goes from determining the data we'll gather all the way down to the individual experiences that inform our research. And so I'll turn it over to Allison, who is going to introduce our panel, where we're going to talk a little bit more about how some researchers are using their own paradigms or the paradigms given to them by their fields to inform their research.
Thanks so much. Okay, so I am incredibly excited and to introduce our three panelists today. We have Dr. Francesca Lopez, who is the Waterbury Chair in Equity Pedagogy and a professor of education at the Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Terrell Morton is an assistant professor of identity and justice in STEM education at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And Dr. Akani Zusho is a professor in school psychology at Fordham University. So we have a couple of questions for them that we'll have them think through. With this first question, I'll ask panelists for two things from you. So to start, in about a sentence, tell us a summary about your research interests or program. And second, can you tell us about how you think about research paradigms in general and why they are important for educational psychology researchers? So I'll start with Dr. Morton.
Oh, the joy of kicking us off. Hello, everyone. How are you all doing on this lovely Thursday? Can I get some reactions, some comments in the chat or something? You know, I think my professor, Dr. Green, said you get to see all your Twitter friends here in space. And so I want to make sure that I can feel you all in this space. But as they said, my name is Terrell Morton. I'm an assistant professor of identity and justice in STEM education. I have the fortunate opportunity to have created that title. So there are no other professors of identity and justice in STEM education. And I think it speaks to the kind of work that I do. So my scholarship really focuses on decision-making and how identity informs the decision-making processes, particularly for Black women in post-secondary STEM, Black students in post-secondary STEM, and then other students whose identities sit at the intersections of race, gender, and another marginalized perspective in post-secondary STEM spaces, such as students from rural communities, students who are transfer students, or students who are first-generation college students. And I ask critical questions of my research participants of what does it mean to be your identity or identities within the context of post-secondary STEM spaces? How do you perceive yourself in relationship to the environment and the structures? How do you navigate your environment and structures? What factors inform those navigational processes as a way to begin to really understand how people grapple with systems of oppression, structures, norms, policies, procedures, and all of these sort of cultural factors that undergird life, and then make self-determined decisions for how they want to show up, why they want to show up, where they want to show up, and what they actually want to do with the things that they're pursuing. And my desire in studying that factor isn't simply just to understand life, but then to really think about how we can begin to transform educational environments, systems, and structures so that we have spaces that allow people to just be, rather than be resistant or be resilient or be gritty or all of those other kinds of descriptors that we assign to people who have to continuously fight and engage these systems of oppression. And I'm certain that I'm probably close to time or over time, but if I'm remembering correctly, for me, paradigms are essential. It speaks to how I show up in the research space. It helps me think about the various identities, perspectives of life, privileges, exposures, and awarenesses that I bring into the research space, and how that then drives the kind of knowledge that I'm producing as I'm now out here writing and publishing and teaching and speaking and doing work. And so I have to constantly think about how I show up in my work, and then politically what I want my work to represent, and whether that's me presenting ideas about other people from marginalized groups that I think is what's supposed to be right, or me using my platform and my power and my privilege to really elevate the voices of the people that I am engaging within this research process.
Thank you so much. Dr. Lopez?
Yes. So I'm Francesca Lopez. I'm at Penn State University. And in one sentence, over my career, I think my research could be summarized as attempting to address inequities. I'm a former bilingual education teacher. I was a high school counselor. And so a lot of that informed the kind of research that I wanted to do, just with the disconnect I saw in practice. And so the pursuit of my research is really to make sure that not only those of us who do research are aware of what that is through publications, right? But also that it gets in the hands of those that make policy, make decisions, school leaders, teachers, right? Who are actually engaged in the practice. So that's who I am. And in terms of paradigms, it's interesting because in thinking about it, it's something that I think we all do. And until presented with this question, it's like, oh, well, I guess we all really have these paradigms, but it's understanding what those are that is so very important, right? So Dr. Morton, for example, mentioned he thinks about what he wants to represent in his work. And I think thinking about that is very important because then you pursue research with intentionality, right? For those of us engaged in educational psychology research, there's the need to think about the paradigms that have always been presented in the field and how some more recent work is challenging those paradigms in the field. I can say that I remember sitting as a doctoral student, engaging in the work that I wanted to do, and those challenges were implicit. And it took quite a bit of time for me to get to the point where I saw the disconnect between the kind of questions I was asking and what I wanted to actually address, right? So, for example, I don't believe that there's such a thing as neutrality. I don't believe it. I think people try to get at neutrality, but you're making an intentional decision in doing so, right? And when we see inequities, there were decisions. There's a lot of power in research that's taken up and people's lives who are affected. I think that those of us who engage in research also have to be very aware that we have to think of the end goal. What is it that we want to inform with the research that we do? And that too is a paradigm. So this notion of neutrality is definitely one I reject. This notion of truth is one I think we all try to get to, right, with our research. So it's such an interesting question to be presented with and think about with you all today.
Thank you. And Dr. Zusho?
Hi, everyone. My name is Akani Zusho. I am a professor at Fordham University. And in one sentence, what do I do? I guess you could say that I've always been interested in issues of culture and how that impacts students' experiences in school, why some students thrive in certain educational settings and why other students don't, and what we can do collectively to ensure that all students thrive, right? That's always been, I guess, the driving question behind my research, and this idea of understanding culture. Like I guess I said briefly before everyone came into the Zoom room that I don't actually consider myself to be an expert on this topic because I'm still grappling with all these issues, but I have been thinking for a long time about, having been born in Japan, coming to the US when I was 3, I've always felt like I've straddled multiple cultures. And even today in the work that I do, I'm living through a time, where we thankfully are talking about issues of race more openly. But I was trained at a time where some of these conversations were not happening. And even like when we talk about research paradigms, I mean, I went through my graduate program kind of vaguely understanding that there was something called positivism and post-positivistic approaches and how most of ed psych probably aligned to that. But did I fully understand what that was and what the implications of that were for sort of the research that I did? Like, no. And frankly, it's only been in the last couple of years that I really have taken on like learning about these things and in teaching my primary teaching assignment at Fordham is statistics, and I think it's really super important for students to talk about philosophy of science and to understand these various research paradigms, and what sort of research they want to engage in, and sort of the tensions, right, like that these paradigms sometimes present, especially if you start to identify, like, I identify as an educational psychologist, and lately I've been grappling with that tension, because my work, I want my work to change the world for good. And sometimes I feel like, the tools that I have been equipped with don't necessarily do that. And so it's been, I don't know, I guess it's, I guess what I want to say is that, I don't have all the answers, but I'm glad that we are here today and that we're talking about these things.
Thank you so much for all of those perspectives. I think building on that point, Dr. Zusho, going into our next question, I'd love for the panelists to reflect on what are your perspectives on how research paradigms are enacted or applied specifically in critical and multicultural research. So let's do reverse order. Let's start with Dr. Zusho.
Can you repeat the question one more time? Just so I...
Yeah, absolutely. So what are your perspectives on how research paradigms are enacted or applied in critical and multicultural research? And I'll put that in the chat too.
Yeah, I think, first of all, we need to define critical and multicultural research, because I think that there are different ways of approaching that. And I think we use those terms sometimes differently. If you're talking about critical approaches to reflect more of like a critical race theory perspective, then, it comes with certain beliefs about, knowledge, reality, multiple truths, and, things like that. I think you can engage in multicultural research that doesn't always align with a critical approach. And, so I think it's, first of all, important to sort of tease that out. I also think in terms of traditionally the work of ed psychology, we have not embraced critical perspectives, and even multicultural research, I think, has sort of been always there, but it's kind of at the periphery, sort of like, oh, it's the last week of a course and I need to talk about culture or race or, gender, and we're going to have multiple, I've always kind of felt that way, even in conferences where you have like certain sessions, or, there's a lot of talk these days about some of the special issues and, some of this sort of being relegated to that space. So I guess we need to sort of work through that. I would say, in terms of my own research, I tend to take more of a pragmatic approach where I am not necessarily tied to a particular research paradigm, other than to sort of say that I don't want to do harm and I want to do good in the world. And I want to recognize that some of the tools that we have, particularly, some of the statistical tools that we have, promote a type of thinking that sometimes, there's a tension there, where, we say, oh, we got a statistically significant p-value and that says X, Y, and Z, or, we found something that's significant. So that means that, I don't think we could start there. I actually think we need to, I don't know, really, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't know if there's only one way in which these things are enacted. I think it's a process, right? And it's really trying to think about, even understanding ourselves. I think, to me, that's the part that I've been working on the last couple of years, trying to make explicit to myself, some of my own biases, where they come from. A lot of it is disciplinary, I would say. And a lot of it is, a reflection of sort of the cultural spaces that I, navigate and are a part of. So I don't know if that answered your question, but we could come back.
I'll go ahead and jump in. So I think to answer the question, what my perspectives are on how research paradigms are enacted, I think it might be useful to present a scenario, because I absolutely think Akani's right. It without definitions, it depends on who's doing the research that's claiming that perspective. So there's a study that I shared with my class, and just for the sake of, you know, everybody being on the same page, my background as a bilingual teacher meant that I was in a classroom with students who spoke Spanish as their primary language. And my goal in a bilingual setting as a third grade, later fourth grade, fifth grade teacher was to ensure that they were getting the content in Spanish so that they would get access to that content, as I also nurtured their English language development. That is a bilingual classroom. It is a group of students who all share the same language. And some scholars have argued that that is segregation. And so now we see a huge movement across the United States for dual language education. And again, like, the definitions matter, because anyone and everyone has kind of co-opted this term dual language, and it can mean a million different things. But for the sake of argument, in a context, it typically means you're bringing together, you are integrating students who speak one language at home and those that speak English typically. And the whole goal in this kind of scenario is that everybody becomes bilingual. And so there are many scholars who have the paradigm, the perspective that separate is never equal. And so you should be bringing in these groups of students together. But study after study, robust study after study that has looked at the outcomes of Latino, Spanish-speaking students in these contexts finds that they do better in bilingual education, where they are with their own groups of students, than when they're in dual language, right? So this is a great example of, you know, people who claim that dual language is the answer to integration and a better society, but fail to consider other paradigms that play out in real life. And in this case, power, right? And inequality is something that in dual language classrooms has not really been contended with. And so when we think about, you know, how research paradigms are enacted, there's the aim, but then there's the reality of what the implications of that research really says. And so to Akani's point, I really think that as researchers, we can learn from that. But very often when you're engaged in critical and multicultural research, I tend to fall in terms of multicultural research with James Banks' definition of it, right? Where it's definitely about power and access and inequality. And so when you're using those perspectives, you have to consider how there are systems that create contexts that play a role in whatever it is that you're examining. So if I'm looking in a classroom at what a teacher is doing pedagogically, I cannot ignore the greater context, right? That is part of a paradigm that I think very often in those of us who share the disciplinary, you know, tenets of educational psychology have had to go elsewhere to really get those, because they were not, as we could read through the APA apology resolution, right? Those were not part of our field from its inception. And so the work that we're seeing that now does fall into these critical and multicultural lines of research has usually had to rely on work outside of that field, right, to make meaning of it.
I appreciate not having to go first on that one, because yeah, it's a lot. And my colleagues have given me a lot of things to process. So yeah, you know, when I come to this conversation of paradigm, being fully transparent, I think of it through like an ecosystems lens. And so within the ecosystem, there are multiple actors, and there are multiple actors playing different roles and responsibilities. So from a research perspective, research from an ecosystem perspective means that there is the scholar who is entering into the context. There are the people existing within the context that the scholar is engaging in research. And then there are these other sort of key actors and players, be it non-research participants, that are informing the research context. So from that perspective, me as the scholar entering in, I identify as somebody who sits on the critical constructivist kind of realm. I understand that there are multiple truths to be out there. I understand that there's concepts of subjectivity that drive how we understand the world and reality and our essence of being. But then I also understand for there to be this sort of universal truth that comes to the power and how power has been constructed as this third space that we are now all responding to consciously and unconsciously. But then I recognize that within the context of my research setting, my participants may not be entering into that space with that same paradigm. The audience that I might be speaking to may not be entering into that space within the same paradigm. And so now it becomes this process of me trying to understand and negotiate how I show up in this space, what I'm very intentional to name at the forefront of this space, and whose work I'm then drawing from as a result of it. And so to something that Francesca was just saying, and even before that Akin was saying, it's like, if I'm going to say multicultural, I have to be very intentional to say what I mean by multicultural, because multicultural can be co-opted and whitewashed in ways that it was not originally intended. We see Gloria Latson-Billings putting out culturally relevant pedagogy 2.0, 2.5, 3.0 to say, hey, this is not what I was saying when I first introduced these ideas, but this is how these ideas have now been taken up and adapted by other people, because again, their paradigms in reading her work was like, oh, well, this is how I'm trying to grapple with it and make sense of it. So when I think of critical research, I'm looking at work that draws from critical power paradigms. That's very intentional to say power is real. Power operates us in these kind of ways. There are these systems of oppression that exist that marginalize according to this social hierarchy that we've created in society, giving society now this third space power to dictate, determine, and control life. And if I'm getting into some multicultural, though I often see a lot of tension between multiculturalism and sort of criticality in some of the writings, it's like Francesca said, it's still being intentional to say, well, if I'm thinking about how people are showing up, I'm still thinking about how they're showing up differently within the context of the structure of power.
Thank you. All right, so we have time for about one more question. So I'll send it in the chat. It's a bit of a lengthy one. But the general idea is, how do the three of you have conversations with students, whether that be through teaching, mentorship, research, as well as your other collaborators, on bringing paradigms into their ways of thinking or approaches to critical and multicultural research? So why don't we start with Dr. Lopez this time?
This is a great question. And I'll draw on a recent example, because I don't think that there's an easy, one way approach to be able to engage in these kinds of conversations, but I'll focus on students just because that's where my mind went. And I was teaching a class on language policy. And I know from my own reflection in the kind of work that I've been doing, I guess over the past 2 decades now, both in the classroom and then as a researcher, is that the information we're presented is very narrow. And we're often pushed, and very few of us, those of us who are lucky enough, I think, to have the pursuit of education and get access to more knowledge, can draw on that. That assumption, that everybody is starting in the same level of understanding is just, it does not hold true. So when I was teaching a class on language policy, I had to think through a lot of the very, for example, toxic discourse that we have in the media about immigration, about, what it means to come into this country as a refugee and then be educated, right, in this system that excludes critical knowledge for most of us. And so I think it's imperative that when engaging in critical work, you do what is needed to level the playing field in terms of knowledge, understanding the why, right? Why is this work important? why are we being inclusive with this? Understanding the role, for example, that the US has played in creating a lot of the influx that we have seen over time, right? All of this is very important because it plays into policies that we then see in classrooms. So, you know, in terms of bringing in paradigms, where I think we're all aiming to get to that one truth with a capital T, and our research might have elements of that is chipping away and trying to exclude the things that aren't necessarily really holding to that truth with a capital T. So different perspectives are definitely important, and different approaches, and that's the richness, right? And the rigor of trying to get at something. But when doing work that's critical and multicultural, it takes quite a bit of effort, because there's a lot of reading and engagement and strategy work that has to take place. And the last thing I'll say is there's also the role of, and Akani had mentioned being pragmatic. I see myself as very pragmatic in the sense of, I want to do work that will actually create change. And if I can get at what stands in the way of that, then I have more knowledge that allows me to help people understand that paradigm that I'm trying to pitch, right? And why it's so important. But yeah, this was a doozy of a question.
Dr. Morton, would you like to jump in?
Sure. First, I think I owe an apology to my colleague for mispronouncing your first name. I sincerely apologize for that. Identity is important. Names have power and meaning. I apologize. That was not my intention. Second, I would say in terms of how I engage paradigms in conversations with students and other collaborators, I have some people that I worked with that are on this call as either students or collaborators, or even some journal editors or stuff who probably read my reviews. And I'm always of the person to say, like, you have to be transparent and you have to be upfront about it at the very beginning. You have to say what you mean and you have to mean what you say. And again, you have to be able to support it through the scholarship that you're drawing from. And so if we're going to say that we are engaging critical research, what is it that we are critiquing? What does it mean to be critical within this perspective? And at what particular level within the ecosystem are we attempting to say, this is how we are acknowledging the presence of oppression and power that we're attempting to push back against? Which then requires us to be transparent and vulnerable about how we're showing up in our spaces. I know we have positionality statements in qualitative research and mixed methods research, and we're starting to see more people do positionality statements in quantitative research. But for me, don't just tell me what your identities are, tell me how they're informing the decisions that you're making regarding the questions that you're asking, the theory that you're drawing from, the method that you chose, the participants, the context, and even being transparent about whatever assumptions and biases that you're maintaining when you're trying to analyze the data. You know, as a cisgendered Black man who engages research on Black women, I understand that there are some things that I will never understand because I am not a Black woman. And so I have to be able to be very transparent about that when I'm even trying to create knowledge around a population that I'm engaging, because who am I to come out here and say, now I am the expert on all things Black women when it comes into STEM, and I have never lived that particular life. So being fully transparent about how you're entering into the space is my approach. And I share that with my students and even my collaborators. And in spaces where there is tension, we then have to decide what becomes the resolution. And the resolution might be that we're just on two different playing fields, and us collaborating doesn't make sense, no matter the project or the particular perspective. Because I can tend to get a little defensive too when it comes to working with marginalized populations. And like was said earlier, I'm not somebody who strives to perpetuate any harm. I'm not perfect, so I will make mistakes, but if I am conscious of it, then I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that I am not harming somebody else. And if I believe that you as a collaborator is trying to do some harm, then we're just going to have a very uncomfortable debate about how we're showing up in this space, and then decide where we want to move forward even if that means we're moving in different directions.
So, I'm reflecting over my career and where I am now versus where I was, many, many years ago when I first started graduate school. I realized that, despite my interest in culture, I've made so many mistakes. I've had so many, there were assumptions that I had that reflected my upbringing, reflected, my training, and that weren't always clear to me and influenced the decisions I made as a researcher and, the analyses I conducted. And as I am teaching statistics to a new generation of researchers, my hope is that it won't take them 20 or 30 years to get to the point that I'm at. And I think it's important for them to engage in these conversations early on in their graduate career. So I teach first year doctoral students. And so I am now very much committed to, actually, I only started it very recently, last year when I taught. I had two weeks out of, I teach a year-long stat sequence, so it's helpful to do, in the sense that I have the time to do this, but I probably should have done more, but 2 of those weeks were dedicated to issues of philosophy of science and quant crit. Did I totally address everything? No, because like I said, I'm still learning about these things myself. But I felt responsible to bring this up and to start, I think Dr. Morton talked about being aware, like just be, to try to understand yourself and where, what and who you are, why you think the way you think, because all those things are really important in terms of the decisions that you're going to be making, not just in terms of choice of methodology, but ultimately in terms of how you interpret the data and what messages you want to, send out into the world. So I guess one of the things I do in talking with students is just having that conversation. I never had that conversation in grad school. And so I think it's I'm grateful that these topics are becoming more and more talked about, and and so that I could incorporate into my classes and my discussions with students, because I really do think that it's important for students to understand what the assumptions are, the history of statistics and where it comes from, and all that. There's a lot to unpack there. What does it mean when we're running ANOVA-based analyses and looking at group differences, and what does it force you to do when you're comparing groups? Do we even want to do that? What constitutes a group? All these things I think are things there was always a sense of unease when I taught those weeks, and because of my worldview, but I never made that explicit to students until fairly recently. And I think, I would love to be able to find better ways to have these conversations with students, but just, making them aware of the fact that there are these different paradigms and that they do influence the way you look at the world, and the decisions that you make, I think is just generally important. So.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for your thoughts on those questions. We're not done with you yet. But to allow a little bit of time to digest and work with all of those thoughts and information, we'll start to move into some small groups, and then we'll come back together for a full group discussion with the panelists after. So I will pass things along to Temi to introduce the breakout room work.
Yeah, so we're going to jump into breakout rooms. I'll be opening those in a few seconds. If you haven't had the chance to, let me get the link in the chat again. All right, there we go. You can click on the link that I just dropped in the chat, and it'll take you to a folder that we've created for all of our sessions. So you can go to the session 1 topics, and in your breakout rooms, you'll need to access a document, the Google document that's called session 1 document. We weren't so creative there, but session 1 document, go ahead and open that up and everything you need will be there. There were some pre-questions in task 1, but we're jumping down to task 2 and there's 3 questions listed there with sub-questions. So you'll have more than enough to talk about and then we'll come back together. So the only other thing to note is that there are links throughout the instructions linking you to our Jamboard. And so once you get into your breakout room, you should see, I guess whenever you're invited, what room you're going to. And so you can just go to the slide title that matches your room number. And that's a place that you can take notes. So feel free to ask someone in your group, maybe the person wearing red today or glasses, if no one's wearing red, they can be the note taker and just add some notes from your session so that you can remember what you talked about when we come back together. So I'm going to go ahead and open the breakout rooms. Feel free to just, I think it's like a raise hand function or something if you need some help. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing what you all discuss.
As we're doing that, I'm gonna bring some attention back to our lovely panelists. And we have just one question from the audience that we'd love to pose to you, and then one more kind of leaving us with some thoughts. So the question, and I'll put it in the chat because it's also kind of a big one, but is thinking about what are recommendations that all of you might have for centering topics like justice and equity and theories like critical race theory into our research, especially when in spaces that might initially see these as distal to the field. Why don't we start with Dr. Lopez?
Yes, in terms of centering topics, I think going to those resources that have helped me that were outside of the field were really, really important. Terrell had mentioned like the co-opting, and that really does happen. So I think that if you're going to use critical race theory, if you're going to use a multicultural approach, going to the sources, the original sources, I think is instrumental. I watched a webinar with Gloria Letson Billings where she said just that, go to the book, the original book that was written about CRT before it was even called CRT, if this is where you're drawing your ideas from. But terminology itself is not resistant to the co-opting. So really understanding those original sources is very, very, very important. That said, we have, Jessica DeCure-Gumby, who has given us examples in the field of how to incorporate critical race theory, how to write about it, how she's used it in her own research. So we do have examples of that. So it can be done, but going to those sources and knowing that it takes time to actually read through and understand what we haven't been exposed to is very important.
Dr. Zusho?
Yes, I would say yes to everything Francesca said. One of the things that we kind of briefly talked about this in our breakout group, but, just going, I think what has helped me is maybe it's in large part because I wasn't seeing conversations around these topics within my immediate field of ed psych, and so by necessity I had to go outside of my home. But I do think that it's really important to work on ourselves and our knowledge and understand that we have, especially, well, for me, I knew I had partial knowledge. I had experiences that I think helped me see and understand some, what critical race theory, for example, was trying to say, and I got it, but did I fully understand it? No. And will I fully ever understand it? Probably not. But I wanted to understand, to try to come to terms with what I did understand, what I didn't understand. And, reading outside my field, reading totally outside. So one of the things I've been, I'm on sabbatical this semester, so I could do things like this, but Marilyn Robinson. I don't know if you guys know her, but she's really hard to read, but she's not a social scientist. In fact, I think she has a little bit of a I don't know. I don't think she particularly has fond feelings for the field of social science. Certainly the positivistic approach that some social scientists have taken. But things like that have really pushed me to sort of reflect on what I believe, and and I don't know, like not stick. I mean, I love the work that we are trying to do in our field of ed psych, but I think it's dangerous to just read within our field, even if it's handbooks written by so I've looked into sociology research. Even I'm embracing humanities researchers in humanities, I think has which totally take a different worldview, has helped me to sort of reflect on what I believe, what I don't understand, and where I need to go more. So yeah, I think those are some of the other things. And then just understanding what our biases are. I think in part of doing this work is actually getting to understand yourself, and whatever you can do to understand yourself and why we think the way you think is always, I think, a good thing to do.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Morton.
Yeah, I'm going back to the question, recommendations I have for centering topics like justice, equity, and critical race theory into our research. I have multiple thoughts. My disclaimer is that I love everyone, I love all, but then I also trust a few, and then I do harm to none, as my t-shirt is saying right now. And I say that to say that if you're going to engage these perspectives in your research, they also need to show up in your life. You can't write about this work in your articles and then be the worst potential colleagues to marginalized people. You can't talk about this work and then turn around and be discriminatory to your neighbors or the people that you see on the street. Like, it has to totally encompass your life, because this work comes from examining and understanding the lived experiences of people who have been marginalized and are continuing to be marginalized through various perspectives. So even if it's attractive and it's a buzzword and you want to put it out there, there are people who have lived, who have sacrificed sufficiently, whose livelihoods are put under attack for doing this kind of work. So yeah, if it's not that kind of lifestyle that you want to live, I would encourage that you don't do it, and you support those who do. Separate from that, I will never ever forget, I had a conversation with Gloria Latson-Billings as a doc student, and I was talking to her about an article that I submitted that had critical race theory in it. And I got some very racist reviews back from this journal. Since then, made the decision that I would never support the journal. And I don't think she quite understood what I was trying to tell her at the time. But what she responded to me was something that has stuck with me. And she said, all CRT ain't good CRT. And if it's not good CRT, then I don't stand behind it. And in essence, to me, I interpreted that to mean that if I am not, as Francesca was saying, reading the foundational scholarship and developing ideas based off of that foundational scholarship, then how am I going to be out here putting out perspectives from somebody else's interpretation of that foundational scholarship? So you definitely have to read. My advisor, love her to death, Eileen Parsons, my whole first year, she said, you ain't got to do nothing but read. That's all you need to be doing right now is reading. And she had me reading, and I was so upset about the fact that I had to read. But I am now grateful about it that she made me read, because I developed that practice of reading. And you do have to read outside your field. Talking about difficult topics, I'm trying to read through Fred Moten right now. And I don't know if you've ever read any of Fred Moten's work, but it is so hard to understand what he is trying to say about life and reality that you can only read a couple pages at a time. You got to think about it, and you got to pick the book back up. But Fred Moten comes out of the sort of sociology, ethnic studies space. So thinking outside of your discipline, reading books, not necessarily just articles, to really, really think about how other people are talking about life and reality and lived experiences are important. Because I mean, psychology as its field has a very distinct history. There are very fundamental perspectives that we draw on. I can't remember who told me this, but when I learned that Piaget studied his own children, I'm like, we built our whole educational system off the fact that somebody studied their own kids, right? It's like, what's going on? So like, it's like, yeah, you really have to read. You have to read and read again.
All right. Well, panelists, we are so grateful for your time. Would love for each of you to go around one last time in about a sentence, which I know is a little hard. What do you want people to carry with them as either they start or continue pursuing their work, pursuing critical and multicultural research? So why don't we go in reverse order? We'll start with Dr. Morton, then Dr. Zusho, and then Dr. Lopez.
Say that one more time. What do I want people to do?
Yes. What do you want people to carry with them as they start or continue this kind of work?
Pick up a book and read. There were some beautiful sources that were shared. I can also drop some others that I draw from. But don't just read by yourself, but do so in conversation, because again, because I believe that there are multiple truths, there are things that you might see in a book that I don't see that could help me understand something differently. So if you have a reading club that has your colleagues or students, if you're students, other students, or a mixed power dynamic that's separate from your classroom spaces, I highly, highly encourage that you do that. For those of us that have chosen to be scholars, we've chosen this lifestyle. So yes, read.
I would say yes to that, and to understand that it's a process, and it's, you know, just because you read Gloria Ladson-Billings, you know, or, you know, I don't know, Geneva Gay or whomever, right? Like, it doesn't mean that you're gonna fully understand critical race theory or to be able to even engage in this work. And I really think that it takes a long time, and thoughtful conversations, people who could push you, people who could question you. Was talking with my group, my students are great at pushing me, and, you know, and to make me think things that I have never thought about before, because they come from different perspectives. And you know, engaging these conversations. And thank you, APA Division 15 and Motivation SIG for holding these workshops, because this, you know, this is new and it's great that we have these spaces now. So I hope that we can continue to have these conversations, and that we all engage in this work.
So I echo everything my colleagues have said, and I will add that what I would love for people to carry is, like Akani said, this is new. I said this in the breakout room that I got to be a part of. I cannot wait. I so look forward to the time when this becomes the norm. You know, these conversations are not, and in the meantime, when you submit a piece to a journal, expect that reviewers are not going to understand, but little by little, we're seeing editors, we have some here in today's session, right, who are diversifying their boards, getting those critical perspectives on the boards, and work is starting to come through on its own, not in special issues, right, to become more of that norm. And know that it's about persistence. It's persistence, and if turned away at one spot, it's about going somewhere else. But there are areas and spaces where this work can thrive. When I had come out of my program, Division G was my home, because Division C had nothing to do with me, right? And that started to change with Jessica DeCurgumby and Paul Schutz's work, and on and on and on. So persistence, it's key.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much. Let's show some appreciation. Everyone throw up a reaction, throw some love in the chat for our panelists. And while we do that, I will send it back to Temi for some closing remarks.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. I was trying to keep up. I'm sure you were too, Allison, trying to like copy all the resources because we're putting them in that document that we shared with you all. So we'll just save the chat and we'll get it taken care of later because there is so much good stuff in here. And thank you all for dropping these journal names because I think a lot of us are thinking like, next what? Where do I send this work and who will actually not give me racist reviews as Dr. Morton's experience was. So we just wanted to wrap up and share some next steps and some things that you can be doing outside of this session to continue your thinking. And then two, building some hype for our next session. So let me share my, yes, all the hype, Allison. I'll share my screen once more. And so in this rather large table, I'm going to zoom in just a bit. So some of you I saw had already accessed it and were using this in your breakout room, but I just wanted to kind of give an overview. I haven't even started sharing yet, my bad. Okay, now in this table that you should be able to see once it loads on your end. This is a table that we shared in the document. It's linked in that document. You'll have access to it after this session. And so it just lists out a few different research paradigms. And so those are going across the top. And then on the side, we have different aspects of a paradigm that you could, or sorry, different worldviews and then paradigms are down here. So all of these things come together to shape like what is the lens that you use to design your research studies. And so I won't go into this in detail, but if you're curious about how do I identify what is a paper's paradigm, feel free to go through this resource that we adapted from a few different authors that are listed down at the bottom here. So you can go back to the source and understand this table for yourself. So feel free to read through those. And so we encourage you to not only look at the tab that's called paradigms, but pick up, as we've been so instructed, a few papers or books and fill it out for yourself. So one, what are your answers to these questions, which you started to do in your breakout rooms collaboratively? And then maybe pick 1 or 3 different theories or authors that you really inspire you and start to fill it out to help yourself learn how to recognize where paradigms do or don't come up in existing research. And so that's just one resource you can use. If you're an instructor, feel free to download this spreadsheet, adapt it, and use it in your classes, because we really do want to work towards getting to that time where this is commonplace and all students do have this instruction in their classrooms. And then lastly, I'll just go ahead and share a little bit about our next session, our last session, which is going to be happening in January. So we'll be talking about impact before design. And so we want to be getting to a space where we are thinking about how can we consider the type of impact we want to have before we design our studies? So taking into consider our paradigms, taking into consideration the communities that we want to be impacting, taking into consideration how harm has been done in those spaces, and designing research projects that really adds to the knowledge base that communities access. So feel free to join us for that session. We'll be getting some practical advice and starting to get into the methodology. But besides that, I believe a survey was dropped in the chat. So please fill that out for us before you go. And I'll invite Allison back in to see if you have anything else you wanted to share with our group before we go.
I think we are all so grateful for you being here. Our intention for this workshop series is that we continue to build a community. So we hope that you'll keep coming back, and we hope that you bring some of your colleagues and peers so that we can continue to be in conversation, challenging, and building with one another. So definitely look out in the new year for information and registration for that next session. But thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope to see you soon. And in the meantime, hope that you have a really restful break. All right. Thanks, everyone.